Everybody, and thank you so much for coming to my presentation here. Good afternoon, I guess I should say. Well, maybe as Carolyn said, there are people on the West Coast listening, in which case, good morning still. It is very cool how we can reach a wide audience with these Zoom conferences, although staring at a computer is definitely a challenge all day. So I'll get right to it. Today we're talking about a study that was conducted, a couple of years ago now, looking at or attempting to look at variations in landowner attitudes toward eastern red cedar prescribed fire. And this involved sending out a survey to different landowners across the state of Nebraska. And we collected that survey data, and just because of other projects and the original grad student moved on to other things, that languished for a little bit, and we've been able to resuscitate it and get it back to a point where we're finally doing some data analysis on all this data that we've got. So the initial study question that we wanted to look at with this project was, how does the structure of these incentive programs that we see in different spots in Nebraska influence landowner willingness and attitudes to manage for critical stages of woody encroachment, especially at larger scales? As I mentioned before, this was a survey that we sent out to the entire state of Nebraska, or across the state of Nebraska. So the way this was achieved was we sent out a mail survey, physical snail mail survey, not a virtual one, to a randomly selected sample of landowners in 5 different biologically unique landscapes. So some went to the West Canyons, Sandstone Prairies, Southeast Prairies, Verdigris Brazil, Elkhorn River headwaters. All of these surveys were sent out in November of 2017. And then a follow-up postcard was sent out just as a reminder about 2 weeks later. And we received responses from November of 2017 to January of 2018. And my slide, there we go. So just as a visualization of where these VULs are at, we've got the West Canyons here in the southwest, we've got Verdigris Brazil and the Elkhorn River up in the northeast, and then Sandstone and Southeast down here in the southeast. Now, why did we pick these particular study spots? Well, we wanted to condense these 5 different regions into 3 case study areas. And we wanted to specifically look at different management philosophies. So in the West Canyons, we have a more fire-friendly cultural integration of fire, where they've been making attempts to reintroduce fire into the landscape. In the Southeast, we have an honorable agreement is what we're calling it at the moment. The idea that, well, I'll help you out with some of this if you help me out with some of this cedar removal stuff. And it's a bit more of a less fire friendly perhaps, but there's still some of that going on. And then the Northeast has traditionally been more of a control, business as usual sort of approach, looking at traditional control methods. Fire is kind of we'll take a step back from that. So the survey itself included 30 different questions on a few different question topics, as well as some demographic questions, just asking about the landowner themselves. The question topics range from the presence of eastern red cedar on their property to attitudes towards cost share, both in general and for eastern red cedar removal, eastern red cedar removal itself, and then prescribed fire. I just want to hit the presence of eastern red cedar as an initial matter. You can see here I've placed the a digital copy of the first page of the survey up, and our initial questions are really just up front. Do you have eastern red cedar on your property? And then we ask a couple of questions about cost share, both for as a general matter, as well as to remove spear specifically. And then we ask landowners about how much land they currently own or manage. And we'll get to the importance of that in just a second. In general, we also asked about attitudes toward cost share. So we see this is taken from the second page of the survey. We wanted to look at the minimum and maximum amount of land that a landowner might be willing to remove eastern red cedar from in 1 year, given some particular cost share reimbursement. And then for this, the questions on the survey, we looked at different levels of cost share reimbursement. So we started at 0%. I'd be willing to remove cedar even if I didn't have any cost share at all, up to 25, 50, 75, and then 100%, as in full reimbursement. That'd be question 11. And just as an example of how a landowner might fill this out, this is not taken from any particular survey or anything. I just made it up. But perhaps the landowner might not manage at 0% cost share, but they do a minimum of 500 acres at 25%, or they might do a maximum of 1,000 acres at 25%. And then we repeated the same steps for the remaining questions there. In addition, we asked a couple of questions just asking landowners how likely they would be to do some of this cost share for eastern red cedar. Would they be likely to join a cost share program to remove cedar? How did they feel about that? Would they be likely to join a cost share program to remove cedar if it also offered some eligibility for better rates on future programs to keep cedar off land that has already been cleared? And again, likely, unlikely, neutral. And the reason we asked that question is we wanted to get to the idea of follow-up management. So you spend a bunch of money to clear cedar for a few years, but then it starts to encroach back. Are you willing to continually manage and follow up and reapply if you get better rates essentially on follow-up management? So for eastern red cedar removal in general, we wanted to look at acreage. How much would a landowner be willing to remove given a certain number of acres? And we asked this question the same way. We looked at the minimum and maximum amount of land that a landowner would be willing to remove eastern red cedar from in 1 year, given some amount of money that you would have to spend per acre. So if it was totally free to manage for eastern red cedar, what would be the minimum and maximum amount of land that you would be willing to manage for? If it was $25, if it was $100, and we worked our way up incrementally to $750 per acre as the cost. We also asked some hypotheticals related to eastern red cedar removal. So we asked, given the level of cedar, which you can see up at the top here. So this is the figure that shows a high degree of cedar present on the property, a medium degree, a low degree, and then none. Given any one of those high, medium, low, or none, or seedlings for an initial management stage, at what level of cedar would you consider joining a cost share program to remove cedar? We all followed that up again with another one looking at management after the initial management. So management after you've done that burn, or you've done that mechanical to get rid of the cedar trees, and you need to do some follow-up management. Would you be willing to, or at what level of cedar would you be willing to join that cost share program to remove cedar? We also asked a few questions about prescribed fire, since of course prescribed fire is one of the methods, one of the major methods for eastern red cedar control. We initially just asked what their view of prescribed fire was it whether it was positive, neutral, negative, and then we also asked them what their change in view, if any, they've had has been on prescribed fire since owning or managing land in Nebraska. After managing land, do they like it more? Has their view on it not really changed, or has their experience left them liking it less? Just to return quickly to our study question, how does the structure of incentive programs influence landowner willingness and attitudes to manage critical stages of wood encroachment at larger scales? We're not going to tackle the whole thing here today. We don't have enough time for that, but we're going to break it down some, and we're going to address a couple questions embedded in this overall question. One is, at what stage of the encroachment process are landowners willing to use these conservation incentives to manage for eastern red cedar encroachment? And then, in addition, what percentage of cost share is needed to scale up eastern red cedar management? And furthermore, does this percentage change among the different regions? And again, this is a follow-up with some of those questions we asked earlier about eastern red cedar cost share for removal. We sent out 420, we sent out surveys, we received back 420 of them. 381 of those surveys had responses with good data from within the study areas. Some of the responses we got were from people who were outside the study areas, whether because someone had passed that along to them or they had maybe owned land at one point in these areas, but then had moved away. Others were blanks. The people had chosen not to participate in the survey and had just returned it to us without any information on it. So we got rid of the ones that weren't relevant, and we wound up with 381. Our goal is to do a cluster analysis on our survey responses, and this is an ongoing process. We're still working on this. Today, we're going to look at some of the results from some chi-square tests that we've run on some of the questions from the survey response. And just as a quick refresh, those three regions I've been talking about, that would be the West Canyons, that's our cultural integration of fire, the Southeast, that encapsulates the Southeast prairies, the sandstone prairies, that's our honorable agreement, and then the Northeast, that's our control, our business as usual. So that would be the Elkhorn headwaters, or the Gray Brazil, that sort of area. So for those in the audience who aren't super familiar, I didn't want to operate under any assumptions. So this is just a big of a refresh, Stats 101. The chi-square test assesses whether rows and columns of some contingency tables, looking at two different variables, whether those variables are associated, related to each other. We have the null hypothesis, and then we have our alternative hypothesis. So the null hypothesis, that's that whether the variables are independent there. And then the alternative is that there is some kind of relationship, the variables are dependent in some way. If our p-value is less than 0.05, we can reject the null. And if it is not less than 0.05, we cannot reject the null. We can't say that there's some kind of relationship there. We don't know. So our first objective, just to refresh real quick, is at what stage of the encroachment process are landowners willing to use conservation incentives to manage for eastern red cedar encroachment? Remember our little diagram here, questions 18 and 19 here look at our initial management versus our follow-up management. And we refer again to that hypothetical sitting up there looking at the diagram, high, medium, low, and no cedar. So when we ran this through the chi-square test, what we found is that we didn't see really any p-values, less than 0.05. Again, the null hypothesis here is the region and the likelihood of joining cost share at that initial stage you're independent. And can't really reject the idea that that they're independent. We can't reject our null hypothesis because we don't have that sufficient p-value. And we saw this also play up with our follow-up management. So we're still running some analysis. We're still looking at some of these different questions, but so far we can't say that there's really that relationship there. On the other hand, objective 2, what percentage of cost share is needed to scale up that eastern red cedar management, and does that percentage change from regions? Just again, brief refresh, we wanted to look at the minimum and maximum amount of land the landowner would be willing to remove given some kind of cost share reimbursement, whether that's 0% to 100%. Again, the null hypothesis would be the minimum amount of acres managed if some percent of the costs in region were reimbursed. So if we look at the 0% and 25%, same deal, we can't really reject our null hypothesis so far. Looking at the 50, 75, and 100%, however, we start to see a different story. So for the 50, 75, and 100%, we do have a p-value less than 0.05. We can reject that null hypothesis. Now, why would the 50%, 75, and 100% be different? And particularly the max. Note that the min does not have that same p-value. So what's special about the 50, 75, 100% max? That's a really interesting question that we're going to jump into in just a moment. But just a visual aid, maybe some visualizations for what these survey responses look like. These are just simple graphs showing the number of respondents from each region and how they fell on these different reimbursements where we see a significant relationship. So Les Canyons, Northeast and Southeast, we can see at the 50% level, there's still quite a few people who wouldn't even bother with any kind of management. So that's that 0 down here. Each of these shows the different kinds of acreage that would be managed for. So it ranges from 100 to 15,000 acres. The 0 is this I wouldn't manage that we saw earlier. I also included, we had a few respondents who had property in both the Les Canyons and in the Northeast. So that's encapsulated by this, although there weren't very many respondents that fell under. What we start to see as we increase from 50 to 100% is that these the 0 that I wouldn't manage steadily shrinks, and those who would manage for more, the max steadily increases. So at the 50% stage, it's largely dominated by 100 and 500 as the maximum acres that you'd manage for. That starts to shrink, and we see an expansion of that 1,000, 2,500, 5,000. You see in the Northeast, that slot there, that's the 5,000, that's the 1,000, that's the 15,000 acres going up here. And again, we see the same thing. We see this in the Les Canyons as well. We also tested for prescribed fire, and we looked at both the current view and the change in view. And note again, for the change in view, we do see that relationship between the ecoregion and the view on fire. And
3 minutes, Connor.
Thank you very much. Train of thought. Okay, so prescribed fire. So the change in view on prescribed fire, breaking it down between the Les Canyons, Northeast and Southeast, we see some very interesting data here. Note that by far the Les Canyons is positive on improved versus unchanged or worsened. All of them have respondents where the worsened is relatively low compared to where the improved and unchanged is, which I thought was interesting to find out. And we see with the Northeast, the highest response is the unchanged, which perhaps we would expect, as well as with the Southeast. Although in both cases, the improved is still higher than I might have anticipated going in. So that was very interesting as well. What are the management implications here? We don't really see a difference among regions when we run a chi-square test for lower percent costs, that 0%, that 25% for redcedar removal. We do, on the other hand, for regions at 50% and above. So what's the difference? One might be the incentives or lack of incentives that are just embedded in these management areas. It could be attitudes towards cost share in general. Some of the responses in the additional comments question we had, question 37, dealt with some of the landowners' feedback was just, well, I'm not really a fan of cost share management in general. So of course, they're not going to be interested in cost share for eastern redcedar removal either. We also had the possibility of like only 50% and above is worth it. It could be a question of bureaucratic red tape or perceptions of red tape, and just running that cost and benefit analysis, that 25% isn't necessarily worth it, but the 50% or that 75% is more worth it. Differences in change in attitude towards prescribed fire among regions. We could see just greater exposure in the Les Canyons towards fire, and that culture of fire integration exposes people, and they're more likely to try it out for themselves. And therefore, we see that view on fire improve versus perhaps a more traditional attitude or a bit more suspicion towards use of fire. And there's also been some variations in personal accounts when you just look at the additional comments section as well. I noticed landowners who have said, I started burning because I saw my neighbor started burning and saw dramatic improvement in forage quality and all this stuff. And I've also seen people who were more suspicious of fire just because maybe there was a wildfire or a controlled burn that got slightly out of control, and they weren't very comfortable with the idea. So I am out of time now. I am very excited by all the stuff we're pulling out of this. This is just a few of the questions and just a few of the analyses that we're running with this data set. So stay tuned for more as we continue to dig into the data. I'd like to thank the Twidwell Lab, of course, Dr. Direct Twidwell, Dr. Reinhard Schultz, who's helping me with some of the data analysis. Brittany Drucker, she's the one who initially sent out the survey, developed and sent out the survey. And then Nebraska Game and Parks has helped with funding. So thanks to all. And here's my obligatory pretty picture of the Les Canyons. And I'm so glad that you all came and listened. I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone has.
All right, thank you so much, Connor. I have a question for you.
Absolutely.
Yes, so when you're looking at the number of acres a landowner would be willing